Hey, welcome to the TikTok Take with Doug Pagitt. This podcast is also going to be a little different. The last two have been a little different than my normal interview styles. This one, I'm doing a presentation via video to a group in Canada who are at a music festival called the Skylight Music Festival. I'm a big fan of that festival. Would have loved to have been there. Lots of conditions that had to do with my summer and travel and hip surgery and all kept me from traveling to Paris, Ontario, just outside of Toronto for this festival. But they were kind enough to let me do a video presentation with some people sitting in the room. So that's what you're going to hear. It goes 45 minutes or so. I kind of get off the rails at the end. I get really pointed. So if you've been looking for that, a little pointedness from Doug about what goes on with churches, hang on till the end, because I think you'll get there. They're good people. I was asked to talk about what it means to be a progressive evangelical. And I think that really matters. I say it in the presentation. I think it matters for the country. I think it matters for religion in this country. I think it matters for the kind of tone and presentation, not only of Christianity, because I'm not all that concerned about the survival of Christianity. I'm concerned about the survival of civility, the survival of kindness, the survival of the planet, the survival of a way of moving forward that can be compelled by the kind of greater things that we all want to see happen in the world. So here it is, my conversation with the good people at the Skylight Music Festival, and I hope you enjoy. Oh, by the way, there's a couple little places where the video feed gets glitchy and we have to come back. I decided to leave all that in there for you, just so you sort of get the feel as if you were experiencing it. Not sure that's a great decision. You'll have to decide if in the podcast it drives you crazy or not. I wanted you to have the feel of what it would have been like to have been one of the people sitting there receiving the video presentation side. So here it is. Enjoy from the Skylight Music Festival.
If I stand here and...
I'm hearing you right now, yeah.
Yeah, good, okay. So welcome, little group. We're getting near the end of the day. People are tired, but thank you for coming. And you're very privileged because Doug Pagitt is a leader in the emerging church, which you, by being here, are a part of. Because Skylight Festival and these other festivals that are happening are part of the emerging church movement. How do we be church in this time as the church is declining? Christianity is not, it's shifting. And that's some of what Doug is going to share with us, and he's, if you were involved with the United Church and the Emerging Spirit campaign, Doug's church, Solomon's Porch in Minneapolis, was often upheld as an example of new ways of being church. And so he's the pastor there and founder of the Open Network, which is this the last in the series of our four around the Open Network folks. So Drew Brown, Kevin Mackins is tomorrow morning. There's one more. So he's at 9 o'clock. Carla, who was just on a couple hours ago, and Doug. So the Open Network is a network of progressive evangelicals who are moving to a more progressive and inclusive expression, and that's what he's going to talk about, because for many of us, progressive evangelical is an oxymoron. So when I was talking about title or what content, I named that, and that's where it ended up going. So we're excited to have him online, virtually. So thank you.
Yeah, hello, everybody. Really great to see you. I wish I was there. I've been in that barn before. I was there 2 years ago. I think the setup was the same way, so I know just what you're experiencing, and really wish that I was there with you right now. So thanks for bringing me a little closer to that. Well, thanks for taking some of your time and giving a chance at this conversation. I know that the virtual sort of experience here, on a video screen, me sitting in my little studio basement in Minneapolis, and you all together there can be, it's not as close and not as personal, and kind of misses some of the essence. And that's actually where I want to start, in my comments about what I think is going on in the progressive movement of Christianity in North America, and also in progressive evangelicalism. So the reason I want to start there is because as great as this kind of technology is, and I really like it, and I do a lot of this sort of thing. I run a podcast, and I do live streaming, and I do lots of virtual meetings for work all over the, with people all over the world. It's really common. But there's something that I think is fundamentally absent in these experiences, and that is that shared human space, air, electromagnetism, biology exchange, whatever it is that happens when people are with other people. There's a lot of new science that's exploring that, like how people pass their biology onto others, what happens with germs, what happens with microbes, what happens with the sort of energy of a person that transmits to another person, and how they receive that, and all that feeling. And the story of Christianity, as I understand it, is one that is built around this notion of the very presence of God inhabiting the very presence of people when they're with one another. That the story of Jesus is rooted around that, the story of faith of the Hebrews and the Israelites and the early Christians, and then the story through history of people being in spaces together. And I think that really matters, not just at a theological level, but I think that it matters at a fundamental understanding of what the good news is. That as somebody who would see myself as an evangelical, and I'll talk a bit about why I still hold that moniker and why that's meaningful to me. So for someone who sees himself as an evangelical, the idea that there is news, like things to tell one another that's new and that's good news, that exists in the world, and that we have a reason to be together, and we have a reason to say things right now in the spaces where we find ourselves. That really matters. So one of the things that I'm going to suggest is that there's a kind of Christianity that I think has been around for a really long time. I want to be part of it. Maybe you do too. It's the kind of Christianity that recognizes that people matter, that the story of Christianity, the story of faith, is the embedded good news in the lives of particular people in certain places doing actual things, right? That it's not just a cognitive notion or a thinking about another time and another place, that the story of faith is not about the kingdom of heaven of another time or a place that we're going to be ejected to or risen to or sent to. But it's this lived experience of people in particular locations doing certain things together, primarily doing life and doing community and doing justice and doing mercy and rearranging the order of how we're living our lives individually, in smaller communities, and a larger society, so that we can live out the best of humanity's expression as it lives in harmony with God. So I think that's what the Christian story is, and I think that's what a progressive evangelical notion is, right? So here's part of the reason that I still hold to the moniker of progressive evangelicals, and that is because as much as I haven't wanted it to be the case, I've been in Christianity. I'm 51, and I got into Christianity when I was 16, almost 17 years old. So, however long that is, I have been in the faith for my entire adult life, but wasn't at all in Christianity up until my late teens. Like, I had no Christian experience at all. I didn't ever open a Bible. I didn't know Christmas and Easter were connected to each other. I never went to a Bible camp. I never went to a church service. There was never a moment on a Sunday morning where I thought or had the expectation that I was supposed to be somewhere else doing some other thing, right? So I'm one of those people that comes from a tradition with just no Christian life, no Christian experience, no Christian background at all. And so the story of Christianity sort of grabbed and captured my life at a particular moment where that story, the story of the life of God, indwelling human beings, people speaking on behalf of God for the benefit and the healing of the world, that story met up with the experience of my life as a late teenager and really animated my life. That's one of the things that a lot of evangelicals will point back to, is this notion of some kind of an experience or of a shift in their life, some kind of a movement from one way of living and being to another. It's a really common thing. In fact, in a lot of evangelical settings and circumstances, if you're not familiar with them, the communities work super hard for people to have one of those, even if they're not even all that legitimate. They work really, really hard for people to have one. So people will say these things like, I used to be the kind of person that just laid around and didn't take care of myself and always had others just waiting on me, almost like a selfish person. And then I turned 2 years old and realized that I should, take care of myself, right? This kind of thing. Like people just have to have some born again experience. But that's super common. So I got into Christianity with that sort of notion, right? That a real life should be, could be, and will be impacted by the story of the Christian calling, not only the historic Christian calling, not only the global Christian calling, but the individual personal experience. So that's how I got into Christianity. And as much as I have wanted for Christianity to be understood by people as sort of a without a first name, right? Like just let it be sort of somehow authentically, purely Christian, right? The way that Prince could just sort of be the artist known as Prince or Cher or Bono, right? Or Oprah. Like someone could that Christianity would just not require all of the qualifiers of, well, are you a Protestant Christian or a Catholic Christian? Are you an Orthodox Christian or are you a Messianic Christian? Are you a Baptist Christian or are you a United Church Christian? Like as much as there's something in me, like there aren't a lot of people to say like, look, couldn't we drop all of that sort of qualifiers, all of those kind of first names about what kind of Christian you are? I've realized two things. One, that's never going to happen. Two, it probably shouldn't ever happen, right? There's enough versions of Christianity that it's really helpful to know, which version are you doing at any particular time, right? So I think it's super helpful. So I think that the notion of there being evangelicals is going to exist. Now, I have no skin in the game about why the category existed, why it existed, in the 1500s, why it existed in the 1700s, why it existed in the 2000s. It just does exist. And at least in the United States, and I think this might be true in parts of Canada too, evangelicals as a sociocultural category wreak an enormous amount of influence and damage.
So just a second, you just froze for a few seconds.
Oh, it was my best material too.
It was. So if you could just back it up 2 sentences. What was the last words he said?
In the United States and I think in parts of Canada.
Yeah, in the United States and parts of Canada. Thanks.
Thank you for that. So in the United States, and I think this is true even in parts of Canada, evangelicals and the evangelical expression of Christianity wreak a enormous and disproportionate influence on the concept of what Christianity is. In the United States, it is, from my opinion, for the most part, a very difficult and damaging influence that it has on the story of Christianity. The thing that's not going to go away is for people to say, well, okay, then Christianity just doesn't matter, because some joker like me and maybe like all of you are going to be like, there are some Christians who don't think about it like that. There are some communities that are organizing in some different ways. There are some other notions about how someone could live. So I think that injecting the term progressive, which I'm not totally fond of that phrase either, but when you combine the word progressive with the word evangelical, it makes both of the phrases have to qualify themselves. And I like that. I think it causes people to have to be a bit more honest about what they're talking about. Like, I want conservative evangelicals to have to own the fact that they are conservative evangelicals. I don't want them to think that they get to claim Christianity or they get to claim evangelicalism without any qualification, as if they're, in charge of the show. So by utilizing a term like a progressive evangelical, it's a way to get into the milieu and to get into the mix and to try to ask people to consider some larger issues around what that means. So that's why I think it matters, because I believe that in the United States, and I can't so much speak to Canada, that if we don't end up with
So what was the last words again?
So that's why I think it matters.
Did we lose it again?
Yes. So that's why I think it matters with the last.
Okay, I'm not sure what I said after that. You frozen again? Are you with me?
So let's
Are we
see.
back? Okay.
You froze right after again.
Yeah,
and now, so do you want us to shut down our video and not see our faces to try it? Or I've got everything else shut down on my computer that would use Wi-Fi.
I don't know. Well, let's give it a try one more time. See how it goes.
So the words were?
Yeah. So I in the United States, at least, I can speak to this, and you can tell me if this is true in Canada or not. If you're gonna, there's some big narratives in the United States that need to change about how we think about one another, how we think about those who are the most vulnerable, how we think about our impact around the world, how we treat those who behave against our norms in our criminal, that it gets treated by our criminal system. There's a whole number of things that in the United States really need to change. I don't think it's possible to change those issues without also changing the religious narrative in the United States that is used to support these versions and expressions of faith that keep those issues the way that they are. They're embedded so deeply that if we're going to seek significant cultural change, we have to get at that which is supporting these ways of being that are counter to the way that I think we should be living with one another in the United States. And I don't think you can change the narrative of religion in the United States without changing the narrative of Christianity. It's the dominant religion. Christianity is. And I don't know that you can change the dominant religious narrative of Christianity if you don't influence evangelicalism. I actually think you can't do it without influencing evangelicalism and Catholicism, both of those. I'm not a Catholic, so I can't work in that field. But as an evangelical, I think there's real work to do to change the religious narrative that supports particular understandings and actions in the world. So the calling to be an active, public, out progressive evangelical for me is not only to do work within the faith, which I think it needs to happen, but also to impact the broader culture in the United States and its influence around the world. And so I think that those are intimately connected. So in my system of belief, the word progressive, if that means future leaning, more inclusive, more positive, and more beneficial to all, that's what progressive means. So that's how I use the term. That a progressive Christian expression is what is rooted in the biblical narrative that we find in our held to scriptures. That the Bible itself, the characters of Christianity in the Bible are more progressive on so many issues than most of us who would even declare ourselves to be progressives. Now, there are some people who see it the other way. They see the Bible and the characters in the Bible and the narrative of the Bible as being fundamentally held by a ancient, conservative, patriarchal religious system. Now, I don't argue for people who see it that way. I hope that they won't. I think there's another way to see it. But I do see why people would read it that way. I happen to think that the biblical narrative, especially the New Testament narrative, is trying to work against all of those. It's working against patriarchy. It's working against tribalism. It's working against conservatism. The notion and idea that Jesus wants Sabbath to be a benefit to humanity and not humanity to benefit Sabbath is so monumental in the Jewish tradition. For Jesus to side with the prophets and say that the Lord does not require sacrifice, but requires mercy and not sacrifice, Jesus putting an end to the notion of a sacrificial system, incredibly progressive. I wish a lot of us would catch up with that sort of notion. The idea for the early Christians that they were going to include people not based on race, religion, gender, any expression of who they are as a person. To hear the Apostle Paul or something, the Apostle Paul saying something like, in Christ there is no Jew, there is no Gentile, there is no male, there is no female. Like a post-gender first century progressive like Paul saying that there's a way to organize life that doesn't categorize people by religious tribe. by religious tribe or by gender exclusion is just fantastic. So not only do I think that a progressive imagination fits Christianity, I think it animates it. I think it roots it.
Just a second. You froze again on the words, there's a way to order. Yeah, quoting Paul. Like you were naming Paul.
Okay.
And then you said there's a way to order.
That's great. If I was reading off of a script, I would just go back and read off of a script.
Yeah.
I'm not. Okay. Here's what I think I said. Well, that's not even important. I won't tell you what I think I said a few seconds ago. I'll tell you what I'm thinking about that right now. There's a way to think about the Apostle Paul and Jesus as conservatives, right? There's another way to think about them as high progressives. Did you hear the part about Sabbath and all of that? Sabbath and the end of the sacrificial system? When Paul gets into his stuff where he says, look, in Christ there is no Jew, there is no Gentile, there is no male, there is no female, there is no slave, there is no free. To hear someone saying in the first century or the 21st century that you want to have the notion of your religious expression not be built around tribalism, not to be built around gender exclusion, not to be built around criminal categories of slave or free or economic categories of slave or free, that is incredible. So not only do I think Christianity fits a progressive mindset, I think it's been fundamentally fueled by it the entire time. It has been a radicalizing, anti-patriarchal, anti-power, anti-empire calling from the very beginning. And so I think one of the traditions that evangelicals really like to hold on to is that we say things like we really care about the Bible. And I think a lot of us do. I think a lot of even conservative evangelicals are doing a lot of real funny business to turn that thing into some sort of a exclusivist mantra that keeps people out or keeps people down. I mean, it's incredible that people could try to pull that off. I just find it to be like, because I get accused all the time of running fast and loose with the Bible, and it's just shocking to me. I'm like, really? Like, could anyone say anything more sort of progressively freeing and openly minded than Jesus saying, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing? Or you've heard it said, love your enemies and love your neighbors and hate your enemies. But I say to you, bless those who persecute you and do good to those who hate you. For the rain falls on the just and the unjust alike. That anyone being any more than Peter, when he's in the house of Cornelius, saying to the Gentiles, hey, we're not even, as a Jew, I'm not even supposed to be in this house with you. I'm not even supposed to talk to you. But now I see how true it is that God doesn't show favoritism. Like, it is just inarguable that the story of the New Testament is the story of the Spirit of God including and progressing and bringing in more and more people from all the spaces, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. There is no boundary to the life and the work of God and to the way and where the Spirit blows. Like, it is unbelievable to me. So I get it that there's conservative evangelicals and there's conservative everythings, right? I mean, there's probably conservative United Peoples and there's conservative Presbyterians and there's conservative Methodists and there's progressive versions of all this. I just think conservatives have a whole lot of answering to do when it comes to caring about the Bible. So I think I think progressive evangelicalism has this sense of like animating not only cultural change but also returning to its provocative roots, to its notion that there is a story of God that is good and is news, and it lands on particular people in certain places. So anyway, okay, so that's sort of an opening frame. Let's take a minute and do a little response. Maybe let you, I don't know, check your phones or give a question or talk to each other for a second or just sort of a moment to pause. And then I want to talk about some of the particularities of what makes it so hard and why in every country I know of, more progressive expressions of religion tend to be less interesting to less and less people all the time. It's shocking to me, but I have some thoughts about that. But all right, so any comments, reactions, questions, pushbacks, amens, anything?
I would say that I agree with you about having to take on the evangelical kind of label and the way you're distinguishing progressive and separating that, because I know, at least here, I feel increasingly frustrated. I'm with the United Church, and for the most part, although there's quite a range theologically and politically, but I feel very frustrated that among the unchurched of the last generation, particularly because we get so much American media, that the word Christian is increasingly being associated in people's minds with a conservative, evangelical, and exclusive. Often, I hear people say that, well, you're a Christian, you are, and then proceed to tell me views that I don't hold, or most Christians I know don't.
Yes, right.
So it's very frustrating.
Yeah, I agree. It's okay. I'm going to hold my comments for a moment on why I think that's happening. But thank you for that. Others? Let me ask you all this question with a raising of hands while I can see you. And I think a new person snuck in the back. So hello, new person. Two of them. Hello.
We've had three more in the last
Three
time.
more. Good grief! It's a revival.
Praise the Lord.
Preach another hour. How many of you go to churches? Okay, let's start there with a raise of hands. How many of you go to a church on a regular basis, or would consider yourself a part of a church community? Okay, most all of you. How many of you go to the church you go to now? You went to 10 years ago or more. Those of you that go to a church that you've gone to for 10 years or more, how many of those churches have more people in them now than they did 10 years ago? Okay, so that's pretty common, right? You're at a religious festival or an arts and spirituality festival, so lots of people might say, if it's Christian, like, I go to church, most people stick around their churches for quite a while. Then you ask, how many of you have more people than you did 10 years ago? And almost no one. That's a very real thing, right? So what's going on there? I will tell you, I live in a conflicted relationship to that question. On one hand, I pastor a church, I train church leaders, I help church planters and people who new church development people start new churches, and I'm pretty deeply inside the religious church economy and subsector, right? I'm in the business, but I'm also pretty certain of this: the modality of churches being the vehicle that carries the story of the good news of a particular people in a place, living out the hopes, dreams, and imagination of God in the world with one another, with their enemies, and with their friends, is probably a failing proposition. Churches, for the most part, are probably not the vehicle or the mechanism that is currently carrying that storyline, and 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years from now will be carrying that storyline. I'm suspicious if they ever have been the mechanisms that were carrying that particular story, right? So I've got a real deep suspicion that I'll never be satisfied about my opinion on, because it would take more research than I'm willing to put into it, and I don't know that anybody else is working on it.
We had one person just ask, could you tell us what the storyline is?
Yeah, that there's a collective of people who are living out the hopes, dreams, and imagination of God as a people in a place for the benefit and blessing of others and of all of humanity. That storyline, right? The thing that Jesus sort of stirs up in people, and the thing that Jesus says, those who follow me will do even greater things than these. This idea that there's a people living out the news of God that's good for the people that are there, good for others, and is animating to the particular people in that space and to the broader society and culture. I do think that's been going on for a very long time. I think it happens very often in settings that for the ecclesiologically centric ones of us don't want to recognize as being a place where that work is being done in a way that it can count. That's a real problem. We don't necessarily have a human spirituality deficit, but we do have a counting problem. We often don't count in the places where we should be counting, right? So that's an issue. Like there's lots of places where healings are done. There's lots of places where people have afflictions driven out of their mind that would almost feel like a demoniac coming to life, right? But we call those like, psychological centers and hospitals, and like there's lots of things going on, right? And there's lots of places where children are brought in close to the teachings of the divine and sitting on the lap of the of the one who speaks for the divine. But we call those child care centers, and like we don't do a very good job because a lot of us church people, and I'm deep in the industry, tend to say, if it's not baptized in our expression, then I don't think it really counts as one of our things. So I think we have to figure out, first of all, how to count the other activities that are happening so that we can understand what's actually happening in our church communities of faith. Here's one of the shocking things I think that happens in churches. Very often, clergy of churches don't know at a very detailed level what the congregants in their church do with their daily lives. And if they know, they don't tend to count those activities as part of the church's activities. Like the things that happen when the church has organized a meeting tend to count as church activities, but the things that happen on, Monday through Saturday during the day or at someone's work office tend not to count. So we have this limited perspective to even recognize what the goodness of what the communities, the people who meet in churches are actually doing as human beings when they're not in that building. One of the biggest problems, and will cause a church to not feel enlivened and attractive, if they only count the things that they do when they're organized officially under that banner. If we would start to see all the activities that happen in our communities as the actions of our churches, there's so much going on. It's unbelievable. We do we do this whole thing where we wanted people to tell their stories in our this church that I'm pastor in Minneapolis called Solomon's Porch. So one of the things that we did was we asked people to volunteer for a coming week. And then during that week, I would send them 5 text messages that said, take a picture of whatever you're doing right now. Now, they knew this was coming, so they would take a picture, and I'd send them at different times of the day. And, my little caveat was, if it's appropriate, take a picture of whatever you're doing right now. And then they would send those, and they would text those back to me. Then I would put those together into a little presentation, and for a 5-minute interview, we would interview people in our community and use those 5 images as the key for what they would tell us they were doing. It's incredible what people do. They care for the elderly. They teach children. They work in call centers where they help people figure out a difficult situation that they find themselves in. They figure out how to make sure that HR and payroll work so that people are cared for and supported. Like they're figuring out how people's it's like modern day miracle stuff that they're doing, right? They're like feeding thousands of people, and they're making sure the system is honest and fair, and they're bringing about goodness and healing. But most of the time, we wouldn't count all that stuff as what churches do because it's happening under someone else's paycheck, or it's happening in someone's free time, and we don't tend to count that as the work that we're doing. So I think that's one of the gospel callings that we should really reconsider as we think about how do we even describe what it means to be a community of faith. What's happened in North America is that what counts as church life and community has shrunk to such a narrow line that there's just not enough there to compete with all the other good things that are going on in the world. And we shouldn't be only comparing those things. We should be comparing all of the things that we're doing. All of the service hours, all of the volunteer hours. Like the number of times that I hear pastors, I don't know what you say in Canada and U.S., I'd say like bitch and complain about something, right? That they would gripe and complain about how people don't volunteer enough. And what they really mean is like just at church. And when you ask those same people who complain about the people in their church not volunteering enough, when you ask them, well, how many hours a week do you think your people volunteer for other organizations or are taking care of an elderly family member or are having to care for someone who has, where they're a major player in somebody else's life and there's no pay for it? How many hours do people in your church spend doing that? They have no idea. They don't actually care. Right? What they mean is, no, I'm talking about how many hours you give to this organization. And that problem of only counting the things that happen inside the purview of the church, that's a huge problem. If we started narrating in our communities all the things that people are doing, and even the people who don't show up at church every week, the things that they're doing in the rest of their life, the kind of contributions they're making to the world, all of a sudden our churches are much bigger, they're much more enlivened, they're much more valuable, they're much more significant for the things that we think matter in the world. So, and that's the kind of thing that I think causes, to the comment of our friend earlier, that's the kind of thing that causes people to say, well, if you're only going to count the stuff that churches do, then yeah, it's really kind of conservative and negative and, sort of like, not all that important. But you count all the rest of the things that people do, because here's the curious thing. You read the Gospels, there's nothing Jesus does that's memorable that happens inside the religious communities or the religious settings, right? They happen by lakes, and they happen at dinners, and they happen on the roads, and they happen in the in-between spaces. But then we end up with this imagination about the good news of God in our communities as if the only thing we should be talking about are these things that somehow have our banner over the top of them. All right, let me pause on that thing and see if there's anybody with a comment, question, response, other thought.
Where you're sitting, so just yell out.
Yeah.
Okay, so do we need a bigger idea of church, or do we need a bigger idea of God or Christ for that?
It's a great question. I wrote a book a couple years ago called Flipped, and the centering notion in the book is Jesus's comment, "You've heard it said, but I say to you." And one of the big flips in the book is this concept of God. And I use the Apostle Paul's concept that God doesn't exist, but that we exist in God, that God is existence, right? So this idea that the notion of God is so much more that not only could you not consider that you could hold it, you can only consider that everything exists in God, right? You even the notion that you would suggest that you could put God in a box is starting in sort of a funny space when it comes to that. But I think you're onto something by saying if we have a bigger imagination about God and maybe however people want to define God, what the notion of God's power, experience, force, goodness, love, energy is doing in the world, and we start to count all of the places where that happens no matter what, you really end up with this great story. Stories of first, like if you look at the Gospels as sort of the Gospels in the book of Acts especially as a style guide for how to think about this, you start to realize that you have these stories that have nothing to do with official expressions of religion. They're always done in these other places, like I mentioned. They most often have some kind of a first name connected to them or a very specific story. There was a guy on the side of the road. There was a little girl who was sick. There was a woman who was bleeding for 12 years. Right? There were really specific narratives and storylines, almost the way that country music sings its stories that are really narrative and really particular and sort of draw you into the storyline by a particular person living a particular experience. The Gospels are like that. Most of our religion, though, most of our Christian religion, most of our church expression has this really little view of God, that God only does actually kind of really certain specific things. You know, like God is the ultimate sort of specialist. You know, really narrow view of what God is up to in the world, and a super generalized expression or proclamation about what God does. One of the problems in progressive Christianity is that we want to speak about the big, and we're not creative enough to know that the way you speak about the big is to speak about the particular. So what we end up doing is having these like lofty proclamations about things that have no first names in them, are not located in a particular place, and aren't particularly good news to any particular person. And it doesn't have to be that way at all, right? Like there's a way to start at the small and go to the grand, or start at the grand and to zoom into the small. But that action of doing both of those, the particular and the macro, is really, really important. And I think one of the things that fails us in progressive Christianity is that not only do we not talk about the particularities of faith, we tend not to talk about the particularities of God, and we tend not to, as Christians, root our progressivism in the story of our faith. We tend to root the progressivism in our progressive culture, and then try to wrap the biblical narrative into that. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's a fine way to do it, as long as you actually do that second part, right? And what I'm trying to advocate for within evangelicals and within progressive mainliners is to root ourselves in the particular narratives of people's lives and the particular narrative of our shared sense of story, narrative, and scripture. And I think it's just fascinating to do it. It's hard. It's really hard. Okay, just another little ballywick for a second. The number of church leaders who I know who say things like this to me is shocking. They say things like, I'm just not really a people person. Like, not really a people person? That's a real problem if you're not a people person. I'm not saying you have to be an extrovert. In fact, it might be better off if you're not. But if you don't care and know about people, if it's not a people movement, there are a lot of really, really good contributions you can make for the world. But if what you're trying to do is to be someone who's curating, facilitating, narrating, including people into a narrative of particular people living out a really good news story in a certain setting, and not a people person, holy momoly, that is shocking to me. So I think part of our problem is, as you mentioned, we have a really small view of God and an even smaller view of people. Like, it's incredible. Like for all the progressives who I know who would say things like, you know what, I can't believe people hold to total depravity. That's ridiculous. I would be one of those. I don't want to offend anyone, but I am one of those. So if you've never met someone who thinks that notion of depravity of humanity is a ridiculous notion that needs to be rooted out of Christianity, I'm one of those. So I know a lot of progressives who will say that. But then the way they talk about people in their church is as if these people are totally depraved and deserve some sort of, like, wow. That Fred Rogers, he was Mr. Rogers, he has this saying where he said, if you knew the story of any person, if you knew the whole story of any person, you couldn't help but love them with your whole heart. That's the kind of thing that I think Jesus would say. I think that's the kind of thing I want to believe about any essence of the divine. That belief that every person is intrinsically not only lovable, but likable. The number of times that churches and communities of faith are confident saying to one another, God loves you, you should love your neighbor, you should love your enemy. Unbelievable. For a lot of professional clergy, they can't actually say to their parishioners, and I love you, without violating some sort of professional ethics, which is just crazy as all can be, right? But even though we become these communities that are about love, I had a friend that said to me, I was told my entire life, he was someone who came out as gay when he was in his late 20s. And he said, I was told my entire life that God loved me, and I never doubted it. What I did doubt is that God liked me. And he said, in progressive churches, I've felt the same thing. I have no doubt that they're committed to loving. I'm really not sure they're committed to liking. That's a poignant idea, right? Like how much are we enthralled with people to the point that we're like, God, I like you. I really, really do. And the lack of capacity to develop the lack of effort to develop our capacity to like one another, it's a real issue in the world. And so a progressivism that is socially right, which I want to be, I think we all want to be right on the issues, but is interpersonally mean, is not helpful. A progressivism, a progressive Christianism that is about love but is not about liking, it's really a problem. So anyway, I think that has a lot to do with what's going on in the ethos of our communities. Is that there's a lot of people who go to churches and they're not sure the other people in the community like them. It's because most people don't want to go somewhere where you're not liked. We may have solved our particular commitment to the love narrative. Love the Lord your God, love your neighbor as yourself, and love your enemy. I just wish Jesus had thrown this little thing about like, hey, and I guess he did, like, be good to each other and like each other and cheer each other on and be on each other's sides and carry water for each other and bless one another and like each other. So, all right. Thoughts, comments, questions? I think we have 10 minutes left, so I'd be glad to.
What more do we need to know about Donald Trump's story so that we can like him?
You know that saying that there's always an exception to the rule that proves the rule?
I don't believe there is, but anyway.
Yeah, I am so eyebrows deep in this Trump stuff. It's really a problem. Here's what I think's going on there. Just as a side note, I think he's performing. I think he's a performer. I think the reason that this is so hard is that he's the opposite of authentic. I think it's all a show and a sham and a scam for some other purpose. So he's created a character that is unlikable and deserves to be unlikable. The person himself, I don't think, is what we have access to. Now, why he's being diabolical like that, and I think it is, why he's being so damaging like that, I don't get. But he has created a persona that he is utilizing for some kind of outcome. And so if you think about his connection to professional wrestling and to reality television, those two things, and essentially, to the beauty pageants, like all that stuff, that's what he's doing, I think, is he's functioning as the character. And a lot of us don't recognize it. So we're engaged in interpersonal responses and not into this is a use of a particular power dynamic. So if we stay distracted on that that this is a person who's operating according to all other ways that people operate, I think that's the grand sham. Doesn't make it any better. I just think it's I don't bother myself having to love a caricature, and he's pitching the caricature.
Thank you.
Which is just my way of saying I don't have to love Donald Trump. I don't know if you got all that, but that was, it was just my.
I worry about who's kind of pushing him, who voted for him, who's supporting him, and I'm afraid to say a lot of it is quite evangelical Christian. But let's go on to something else. You're a Baptist minister.
I'm not.
Oh, you're not.
I'm not a Baptist. Nope.
Evangelical.
Yeah, I'm just a generic evangelical.
Okay.
Yeah.
Pardon my evangelical. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm a lapsed evangelical. I grew up in Baptist Associated Gospel, and my parents were Pentecostal, for that part. But I've been with the United Church for a number of years, and it's been a great relief, I must say.
Yeah.
I just wonder how you're going to bring some of those folks along with you. I realize there are new generations now who are thinking differently. What are you doing? Personal salvation, you must be born again.
Yeah.
Come forward, commit yourself to Jesus, or you're going to go to hell.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Can I make a comment about that, the people who voted for Trump thing for just a minute? I think it's true statistically. I buy these statistics that 79 or 80% of evangelicals voted for Trump. I'm in the 20% that didn't, the 20% remnant. What's shocking is 65% of Protestants voted for Trump. 70% of Catholics voted for Trump. 55% of whites voted for Trump. Like 60% of women, Republican women, voted for Trump. There's a thing. There's a whole problem that's that this country has to deal with. I think that is connected to your other thoughtful comments there too, and that is, what do you do to bring these people along? Our community right now is doing something we've done as a regular pattern for our sermons. We read entire books of the Bible out loud as the context for the sermon, and then have a live midrash conversation about the passage. So we're reading through the book of Acts. The chapter we just read last week was where Peter has that vision where this sheet comes in front of him, and it has all these items that are from the book of Leviticus that are forbidden to be eaten, and it's reptiles and birds and hoofed animals, and the voice in this vision says, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." And Peter says, "No," and then, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." No, so it happens 3 times. He says no, and so like a direct defiance to the voice of the Lord in a vision. Peter does. Then the men from this person named Cornelius's house, who's a Roman soldier, God-fearing, but a Roman soldier in Caesarea, where Caesar, the head of Caesar, or the capital of Caesar's empire, sends these men to Peter's house to get him. Peter goes with that man, with those men, into Cornelius's house, and goes into Cornelius's house and says, "I'm not even supposed to be here, but I had this vision." And then these guys showed up, and the vision said that these men were connected to that vision, so that's why I'm here. What do you have? And they say, "Well, I also had a vision." And while Peter's talking about, this story of Jesus, I think, might include Jews and Gentiles, the Spirit of God is alivened on these people like it is everyone else. And Peter says, "I now see how clear it is that God doesn't show favoritism. The Gentiles are included." Massive shift, right? Like, for Judaism to lose its Jewish selectivity was a really big deal for Peter. Circumcision's about to go. Sabbath is already gone. Now exclusivist around Mosaic teaching in the law is gone. The first line of the next chapter 10 or chapter 11, is the people in Jerusalem heard that Peter went into the house of a Gentile, called him back to Jerusalem and said, "Is it true that you went into the house of a Gentile?" What happened was, Peter was Jerusalem-centric and thought that God showed favoritism. He had an experience in the house of this guy named Simon the Tanner, this vision, that ends up in the house of Cornelius. And what Peter then did was went back to the people in Jerusalem and told them what happened. That then caused a split in the church in Jerusalem. Some went with Peter, and some still continued to fight, and they became what were sort of referred to in the book of Acts as the circumcisers, the one who demanded that people would be circumcised. So there are so many evangelicals, who are people who had an evangelical experience. They saw through it from the beginning. They saw the exclusivism, they saw the threats, they saw the nonsense, they saw the mean God narrative. They went into somebody's house, and they're like, "God doesn't show favoritism. This is fantastic." then they never went back to Jerusalem to say, hey, there's this other story. So what I'm trying to do is to enliven evangelicals into the public sphere, because here's what I know to be true. It's too painful for someone in your situation, I don't know if it was true of you, but so many people I've talked to who are in situations like yours, to go back interpersonally into your family or into that church. The power dynamics are just unfair and abusive. So they won't be able to go back personally to that space. So what we're trying to do is to create the conversation point where the people in that conservative world, the people in the you've gone into the wrong places and broken the gospel, have to talk to the people who are like, it's better than you could ever imagine. What's happened is most people who've had that it's better than you can ever imagine experience have just walked away and have never come back. This is also what Joseph Campbell calls the hero's journey, right? So if you know Joseph Campbell stuff, that he has this whole notion about the hero's journey where a person has an experience, goes on a quest, has a kind of vision, then comes back to the community and says, here's what I found. And then the community can decide to accept or reject. That's what you see in this gospel narrative. It's the human endeavor. It's what happens when people grow up. It's called maturity. It's the thing that's supposed to happen. And what societies can do, religious communities and societies, is to create the mechanisms by which people can share that back into their broader systems and structures. So that's what some of us who keep these communities going and try to have conversations like this and so many other things are trying to do, is to build those feedback opportunities so that the conversation can keep going and moving. But it's super hard, barely works. We're kind of barely hanging on. It's super swimming against the rapids. I mean, you look at the salmon and you think, that's what it feels like, that you're just returning home for the spawning season or something.
Did you hear that? We will pray for you.
Thanks. I'll take it. Hey, thanks for sticking with me to the end there, folks. I hope you appreciated the conversation. It was a fun one for me to have. And I think it went over well with the people there. It's always hard to tell when you're just doing a video conversation, but if you enjoyed this podcast and you want to tell other people about it, please do. It really helps. When people say, hey, what do you listen to or what do you watch? You say, on occasion, every once in a while. There's a chance when I've burned through all my other podcasts and I'm now onto the TikTok Take with Doug Pagitt, and it's okay. If you tell people about that, I'd really appreciate it. Or share it on Facebook or Instagram or Snap it. Or do whatever it is that you fancy kids do to tell your friends about the things you listen to. And there might be a change coming in the branding of this podcast. Nothing you'll have to change. Your stream will stay the same. You can just keep getting this on iHeartRadio or TuneIn or on in iTunes or Spreaker or wherever it is that you listen to this podcast. You'll be able to keep getting it. But I might change the frame, the branding, the title, the sort of concept around the podcast. I think you're going to like it. I think I'm going to like it. I think we're both going to like it. We'll see when it comes. But thank you. I really appreciate you listening. Enjoy your day.